So recently I rewatched Iron Man 3 since it came out 10 years ago this month. It was the start of the 2013 summer movie season. And this is a movie that is very, well, I don't know exactly what the right ways to say this. It's met with some controversy, with certain creative choices and some stylistic ones as well. In the grand scheme of things, I don't really know exactly how many people feel about it now, looking back on it, now that we've seen the completion of Tony Stark's character journey. But the plot of this movie is Tony Stark reeling from the events of the Battle of New York, experiencing anxiety and panic attacks, readjusting to life after the war, so to speak. And a new threat pops up on the scene in the form of the Mandarin, played by Ben Kingsley, and Aldrich Killian, played by Guy Pearce, who is one of his associates. And he has run into Tony Stark once before in the past, which Tony Stark's actions, or lack thereof in this case, have all come back to haunt him. And we are going to go into some details about the plot, so if you somehow have not seen this movie, there's your spoiler warning. Don't listen to anything that I have to say, or if you just don't care about spoilers, balls in your court. I do remember seeing the trailers at the time as they were coming out. It was actually kind of exciting to see where Tony Stark was going to be after the events of the Battle of New York in the first Avengers, since in the trailers they gave off the impression that he was traumatized by what he experienced, and they do follow through on that with showing exactly how he's affected by what he saw. Now for Tony, this is a stepping stone in his character journey. He manages to get through some of his trauma with the help of this young kid that he runs into in Tennessee, and he still has a long way to go in coming to terms with what he experienced in New York. And I think in that respect, this is the film's strongest point. This is among Robert Downey Jr.'s best outings as the character. With his quick wit and deflection with humor, it's pretty clear that this guy has got a lot of stuff boiling underneath the surface. He's afraid to let it come out, and only will let it out to certain people that he trusts, like Pepper Potts, and maybe to a certain degree James Rhodey. Particularly in the scene where he tells Pepper what exactly is going on with him when he's trying his new Mark II or Mark 42 suit, which is a really neat design, by the way. But I like that how he's able to vent to Pepper Potts and how he's feeling about his panic attacks and how nothing's been the same since he saw all those things happen. I mean, when you experience stuff with a super soldier and a demigod and a god of mischief that wants to rain destruction on the planet, how do you come back from that? And I think it's a similar question that war veterans would be asking themselves too. When they go off to combat and they see all these horrible things that are done by other people, how exactly do you reconcile going back to everyday life? The movie doesn't really try to answer that question. It does kind of present it out there, and it leaves, I think, it open to interpretation depending on what the person is experiencing. And at one point, he actually has a night terror, which causes his suit to wake up in the middle of the night and scare Pepper out of her bed. And she ends up storming out of the room to sleep on the couch, which I gotta admit, that was, I always found that kind of inconsiderate. She was acting a little bit prissy. I don't know, is that the right word? I don't know. I think she was acting a little inconsiderate instead of trying to comfort him. He was clearly not doing it intentionally. I don't know if I'm alone in that, but I just found that kind of mean on her part. Just me, though. But a little backstory with how I saw this movie. This is actually a very unique experience for me because this came out when I was in the middle of my military training. I had completed basic training and was doing what we call Advanced Individual Training, or AIT. I got to see it later in the month as it came out because with my 8 weeks of AIT, I can only experience certain freedoms as the training went on. And I think it was about halfway through, we were allowed to go off post on the weekends, as long as we were back at a certain time, and didn't travel any further than we were allowed to. So we went to this shopping mall, which had a big movie theater just off the base that we were training at. Me and a couple other guys in my platoon decided to go see the movie. And I also remember reading some of the reviews in my downtime on my phone when we were allowed to use our phones, reading some reviews that really weren't specific on what was going on, but certain fans were not too happy with certain choices that were made, particularly with the Mandarin, which we'll talk about. And to experience a sense of normalcy again, which I had gone to see a movie once before with my mom for basic training graduation day, it was a very surreal feeling to have this experience with other people in an auditorium and feel like you were actually back in civilian life, in the ways that we remembered at least, before we entered the military. So as I experienced the movie as those events were happening, and particularly with the Mandarin twist, I thought, oh, okay, yeah, this is not going to go over well with some people. The film is directed and co-written by Shane Black, who you might recognize as the writer and director of Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, The Nice Guys, and he's had a writing credit in several films like Lethal Weapon and The Last Boy Scout. He brings a style to this movie that was not present in the previous two movies. It's a very dark undertone, but also a unique sense of comedy that's either going to make or break the movie for some people. Humor in the MCU has been talked to death so many times at this point that there's really no need to rehash some of the points I've already made. But I was able to roll with it for the most part, even though there's a few times where I went, okay, you're kind of overdoing it here, particularly with Ben Kingsley's performance when he reveals himself. When you combine Shane Black's style of humor along with Robert Downey Jr.'s quick wit, you're going to get a lot of great stuff, and particularly with his pop culture references.
I loved you in A Christmas Story, by the way.
I'm cold.
I can tell. You know how I can tell? Because we're connected.
And with the young boy Harley, played by Ty Simpkins, who he runs into in Tennessee, he actually manages to talk some smack to this kid that I don't think I would be able to say those things to him, and maybe nobody else would, or most people wouldn't. I mean, I've wanted to say stuff like that to some kids, but the fact that Tony Stark has the guts to do that, that makes me go, that was bold of you. Good job. But still, it's just a kid. And it's really easy to criticize child actors because they don't really have a lot of experience, and some of the time they don't pair up with a director who knows how to work with kids. In the case of Iron Man 3, I think Ty Simpkins is really funny in this movie, and especially in the first Jurassic World, if you remember him when he says, they're gonna shave our heads and we have to make root beer in the toilet. We will talk about that eventually one day. And he even shows up in the ending of Avengers Endgame at Tony Stark's funeral, which I've always really liked, that little touch. I wish he had more to do in that movie for just one small scene, but that's neither here nor there. And kind of like how Jarvis is the Alfred to Tony Stark's Batman, Harley, I think, is the Robin or Oracle for Tony Stark's Batman. For anyone who doesn't know, Oracle was Batgirl in the Batman comics and then later became Oracle when she was shot in the spine by the Joker because she was confined to a wheelchair. But she was the voice in Batman's ear guiding him through certain areas. Harley does a very similar thing with Tony Stark in this one, and I guess it's safe to say that Tony Stark in some ways is the Batman of the Marvel Universe besides Daredevil, in the fact that he doesn't have superpowers, but he has this big company that he uses as a front for his superhero endeavors, which also makes him rich. Bruce Wayne has a very similar thing with Wayne Enterprises, and he uses it to supply his crusade as Batman. The only difference is, Iron Man goes out at both daytime and nighttime. Batman only goes out at night. We even get to see War Machine become the Iron Patriot and doing his own thing by hunting down terrorists in the Middle East. Don Cheadle doesn't really have a whole lot to do in this movie, but I do like the moments that we get with him where he helps Tony in the climactic battle. He's able to save the president while Tony has to go after Pepper, who's being held hostage by Aldrich Killian. And speaking of that, the other people that we see in here, like Rebecca Hall, Miguel Ferrier, who I believe was in the first RoboCop, he plays the vice president, and he's actually in cahoots with the Mandarin, and I guess is trying to help his young granddaughter who's disabled, which also explains something as I rewatched it. Since the Mandarin was able to hack into the president's phone, the president asked, how did he get into my phone? And then I remembered that the vice president was in on it, so I thought, oh, wait a minute, he must have found a way to get a hold of his phone and put the information that he needed in there. It's not really touched upon, but it is, I think, in some ways pretty clear if you're paying attention. We also have William Sadler as the president, who you might remember as Colonel Stewart from Die Hard 2. And James Badge Dale, who was known as Chase Edmonds in season 3 of 24, he's basically one of the Mandarin's henchmen, and he's part of this extremist technology that causes people to turn into these fire people, almost like the Human Torch, but not really the Human Torch. And he gets into a scuffle with Happy Hogan, who's able to figure out certain things when he sees Aldrich talking with Pepper at Tony Stark's company. Being the good bodyguard and caring person that he is, he wants to make sure that everything's okay. And I like how they make Happy Hogan proactive and not some bum that doesn't really know how to fight. In the second Iron Man, when he gets into that one-on-one scuffle with that one bodyguard, even though Black Widow was able to knock all the other guys down, I do like that Happy's able to hold his own in a fight, and he's not afraid to stand up to people. And there's a really nice payoff when he wakes up in the hospital, and the show Downton Abbey is playing on the TV, and the nurse tries to turn it off, but he says, no, leave it on. It's my favorite show. My mom and grandparents are into that show. I don't understand it, but hey, that's just me. No disrespect to anybody who likes that show. Oh my god, I just remembered. We actually get to see Yinsen in the opening scene when Tony is in Switzerland at the New Year's Eve party when he runs into Aldrich Killian. So Iron Man 1 was not his first time running into Yinsen, apparently. And I remember the first time I saw the movie when that song Blue by Eiffel 65, which nobody even knows anymore. It's a product of the late 90s, early 2000s. The moment that song started playing, instantly took me right back to when I was 9 years old hearing that on the radio. And that's where we meet Aldrich Killian, who's basically the fanboy who wants to meet their hero really bad, but ends up getting burned when the hero lets him down. It's something that we've seen before many times in other movies. Not that it can't be done with skill or anything. It has been done correctly before, like in The Incredibles, for instance. But in other movies like Batman Forever and The Amazing Spider-Man 2, yeah, let's not go there. Although Jim Carrey's Riddler is okay. That's a whole nother discussion, though. In the case of Iron Man 3 with Aldrich Killian, I don't really find him that compelling. And I guess I could kind of see why he wants to create the Extremist program to help people who are physically disabled and handicapped, because he recruits all these military veterans who are physically disabled. They're missing an arm or a leg or something. So he creates the Extremists in order to grow back their arms or legs, kind of like the formula that Dr. Connors uses when he becomes the Lizard. But even when I first saw this, it was pretty clear that the movie was making him out to be the big baddie, and that Ben Kingsley's character, Trevor, was just somebody that they were just using if they had to. Like when he walks in and says, unless you want to get shot, don't look him in the eye. With the eventual reveal in mind, it makes sense because he's an actor. He doesn't want anybody to throw off his concentration. Otherwise, you'd end up like that poor guy who got screamed at by Christian Bale on the set of Terminator Salvation. And at one point in the climax, when he's fighting Tony with his extremist powers...
You said you wanted the Mandarin. You're looking right at him. It was always me, Tony. Right from the start. I am the Mandarin!
First time watching it, and even now, I thought, no, you're not. This is not a knock in any way against Guy Pearce. He's been good in other movies before, but I think the material here isn't really that strong. And I think that it needed more time to develop, and I don't really understand, beyond the fact that Tony wronged him some years ago, why exactly he wants to do this in the first place. Maybe to prove to Tony that he's the bigger genius than he is. To me, it wasn't really clear. I don't know. I haven't really watched this movie enough times in comparison to the first one, which I still think is the best one of all three. Although in some ways I would argue that this movie, as far as the two sequels, is actually better than the second one. And I also think in some ways the second one's better than this one. To me, they're almost interchangeable. It kind of just depends on your taste, I guess. I would say this one has more focus to it and is not weighed down by other stuff that the second one was, where it was trying to set up S.H.I.E.L.D. and the events of the Avengers in some ways. But I also do like that Jon Favreau stuck around in the MCU, even after all the stuff that happened with Iron Man 2. He's still on good terms with the studio head, so it's not like there's any bad blood or anything. If there was, we'd know about it by now. I also really like the fact that it takes place at Christmas time, but it has a similar feel like the first Die Hard, where you could watch it at any time of the year, as a summer movie, and as a Christmas movie. And I guess to settle a question that may or may not have been asked in the case of this movie, this is a Christmas movie, but you could certainly watch it in the summertime, and I don't think anybody would complain. Similar to the first Die Hard. But I guess we've held this off for long enough. The reveal of the Mandarin, where he's actually an actor and not the real Mandarin, the setup of him being the bad guy is actually skillfully done. And Shane Black does a really great job of showing all these news clips of how the Mandarin's reigning terror on all these other areas of the world. He's basically the Marvel Universe's Osama bin Laden, how he would get on TV and brag about the certain things that he did to the Western world. You'll never see me coming. You could be a meaning in the game of life. And it makes us, the audience, go, oh my god, this guy's freaking scary. Let's go get him. And then he finds the Mandarin and we go, who the hell is this? And it's revealed that he's just an actor putting on a facade in order to cover up the real thing that's going on with Aldrich Killian, throwing off the rest of the world so he can establish his power. And we got Ben Kingsley, who's an Oscar winner for playing Gandhi back in the day. It's safe to say one of the best actors alive. He is actually really great at playing someone who's really just an idiot, or just someone who's doing this for fun and not really interested in what's actually happening. Thankfully, does not come off in the wrong ways like an idiot or a buffoon. He's able to play it very convincingly. Whether or not you like his style of comedy in this scene, well, that's going to depend on who you are. But I actually found it kind of hilarious when he does this.
They gave me plastic surgery. They gave me things.
Did you just nod off? Hey.
No, in a lovely speedboat.
He shows up again many years later in the MCU in the Shang-Chi movie, Legend of the Ten Rings. The reveal here isn't really as obnoxious or as like, really? This is what we were building to? So in some ways, the blow was softened, knowing what happened later on. And I think in the framework of this movie, it works okay. But to do this to an iconic character in comic book lore, that was probably not a smart thing to do. And people will argue that it was gutsy, original, and different and fresh, and they had a lot of courage to make that choice. Maybe that's true, yeah, but I'm gonna keep saying this for as long as I have to. Just because something is original and different doesn't mean that it's good. What they could have done is maybe similar to what Batman Begins did, where you had Ken Watanabe's character as Ra's al Ghul, you have him die off in the middle of the movie, and then you see Liam Neeson return again and reveal that he is actually Ra's al Ghul, and that the guy that we met before was a decoy. You could have had something similar to that, where Ben Kingsley was just a decoy, and then the real Mandarin shows up in the form of, say, maybe Ken Watanabe could have showed up as the real Mandarin, who knows? And maybe they could still do that with the Shang-Chi stuff. You never know. With Marvel, they might have something up their sleeve that we don't know about. To have a big guy and then reveal him to be a nobody? Well, in some ways in the movie that doesn't quite work. and I think it's probably the weakest aspect, and it's something that really takes away the momentum that this movie was really hyping up in the beginning. In the grand scheme of things, like I said, it doesn't really hurt nearly as much. I still don't think it was the right decision. And I heard another reviewer that I used to watch when he was talking about Iron Man 3 in his spoiler review. Let's say in The Dark Knight, when he was looking for the Joker, and he runs into the Joker, and it turned out to be some hippie burnout in his mom's basement, where Batman breaks in and goes, "Where's the Joker?" And the Joker would sit there and go, "Oh, this is awkward. My name is Bob. April Fools." Me and everybody else would have said, "That is the dumbest thing you could possibly do." So in a way, I can understand some of the frustration from the fans. But even with the weakest point, you do have to acknowledge the strong points, which I've already talked about earlier. Is what I really like is that when Tony is stripped away of all his technology and his house is destroyed when he issues a warning or a threat to the Mandarin on live TV, it's when he's stranded out in the middle of Tennessee trying to figure out what's going on. He's got nothing left and everybody assumes that he's dead. He's forced to improvise his tactics and rely on Harley in order to help him guide him to where he needs to go, and eventually Jarvis when he gets his suit back online. Almost kind of reminds me of The Dark Knight Rises, which came out a year before this, where Bruce Wayne was stripped of all of his resources, where he had to improvise his tactics and get back to Gotham City to save it. When you strip away all the technology and all the toys that superheroes have, it's really about who they are as people at their core. That's how you get some of the best comic book movies, like the first Iron Man, the Dark Knight trilogy, Captain America the Winter Soldier, and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. And I think to various degrees this movie does excel in that area. I just wish the villain aspect was more complimentary towards that. And as far as Tony overcoming his anxiety attack when he experiences yet another one, I like how Harley is able to talk him through it on the phone, where he's talking him through his feelings, acknowledging what's real and what's not. That is a common thing that my mom and I were actually talking about not too long ago. As someone who has struggled with anxiety in some respects, this I think was a great representation of that stuff. When it comes to the action, it's not quite as fun as it was in the first movie, but in particular the sequence when Tony saves the people falling out of Air Force One over Miami Beach, that I thought was actually kind of fun. I really like seeing all of the Iron Man suits coming towards that shipyard in order to help Tony defeat the Mandarin for good, Aldrich Killian, but you get what I mean. And I'd be failing myself if I didn't say that when Tony says,
What are you waiting for? It's Christmas. Take him to church.
how has somebody not made a parody video playing Hozier's Take Me to Church right after he says that? And we even get to see Pepper Potts affected by the extremists, which is also a prelude for how we see her kick ass in the later films, in particular Endgame at the climax. She gets to put on the Iron Man suit in order to help Tony survive the collapse of his house. And then when we see her fighting off the goons, or I believe fighting off Aldrich Killian, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Although I think some of the ways the film concludes and brushes over those certain things with how Pepper was able to be cured of all that stuff, and how they removed Tony Stark's arc reactor from his chest, which I think they established in the first film that if you remove it, it would kill him. And then the film says that they found a way to do that, but they don't really delve into it. Now maybe it's left to the audience's imagination for some reason, okay fine, but it doesn't hurt to give us some clarity on what exactly happened. But I do really like the ending monologue and how he's standing at the edge of the remains of his house in Malibu, where he says, "You could take away all my toys, and you could take this or this, but I am still Iron Man," which is a line that still hits me to this day, knowing where he ends up in Endgame. And the post-credit scene that we get is actually kind of an odd one, since he's talking to Bruce Banner about all the stuff that he's experienced, which is basically all the events of this movie, and Bruce is just falling asleep the entire time, not even listening to it. Who made this guy a counselor? He's a scientist. So Iron Man 3, I would say, is in some ways a better sequel than the second film was, although in some ways I think it's just about on the same level as the second one. And as a piece of the Infinity Saga puzzle, I think it's actually very complimentary to Tony Stark's overall character journey and where he starts out and where he ends up, and how he's able to rely on his own skill set and not so much his technology in order to fight off the Mandarin, I think is really the film's strongest point. I just wish that the villain department was a lot more complimentary towards that as well. I could see why some people would rate it really high or rate it really low for the Mandarin reveal especially. If I had to give it a grade, it would be a 7.5 out of 10 or maybe an 8 out of 10 maximum. Not that Rotten Tomatoes really matters at the end of the day, but the consensus on that website is 79% positive. So if anything, there's some good to take away from this movie. So those are my thoughts on Iron Man 3. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie, what you thought of the Mandarin twist. Either way, let's just try to keep our heads on straight. Thanks again, guys. See you in the next one.